I mean, we don't
I
have,
think we can start.
of course, the legislative initiative, but that doesn't mean we can't put the
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for being here for the sixth panel on unequal protection against occupational risks. My name is Otse Falilo. I'm a legal researcher at the European Trade Union Institute in the Health and Safety Unit. And just to bring first some technical remark, then I will introduce the topic. In terms of the technical remark, please notice that we have interpretation available. So we have it in French, English, and Spanish, both online and in the room. Channel 1 for French, Channel 2 for English, Channel 3 for Spanish. Also, I invite you to use the Q&A online to ask your questions, even during the presentations or during the debates, and I will pick them up at the end and address them to the speakers. In terms of the contents, some introductory remark. So, as you know, the conference that we have for today, starting today for the next days, are a blueprint for equality and being sure that everybody, when it comes to work, benefit from at least decent and same or adequate working conditions. When it comes to health and safety, one thing that we need to remember is that no workers, regardless of the sector and the sectors and the task, no workers should lose their life earning it. And I would like to stress one thing as well, is that since recently, the beginning of the month, health and safety is recognized by the ILO as a fundamental right and principle, just to emphasize the importance of health and safety. In theory, what about equality? So we have a theoretical framework, we have laws, especially in Europe, where that say that regardless of the sectors and for all occupation, the employer has an obligation to prevent and to address all the risk related to all aspects of work. What is it in practice? In practice, it's different. And when we look at the reality, workers are not equal in the risk they're facing, the degree to the extent to which they're exposed to this risk, and the prevention and the protection they can get against these risks. And on that note, I would like to maybe make a quick comeback to what Professor Nicola Contoris said in the introductory remark of this conference, mentioning COVID. Well, COVID is an example of inequality when it comes to OSH, because even though all sectors and all work has been impacted by COVID, it wasn't the same if you were a frontline worker or if you were able to work behind your computer at home. There were risks, just not the same. And beyond the pandemic or beside the pandemic, there are other risks in our society, in our economy, that impact differently workers depending on the sectors and depending on their work. And one of these risks is the chemical risk. And today I would like to focus on one in particular, one chemical, which represents 25% of the global herbicides market. It is glyphosate. The use of glyphosate is widespread in our society. It can be by private people, it can be professionally. We are all impacted by it to certain measures. Sometimes it's an environmental exposure, sometimes it's a professional one. But for the people who are exposed to it in their work, the exposure might be really dangerous and impact negatively their health on the long term. And on this, we're going to go back in this detail later. So glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide that destroys all plants present on the land. And there is at the moment the question of its ban or renewal, which is at the middle of some debates at the European level. And it's a question about how do we protect workers, the environment, but also the economic consideration at stakes here. And the question we're going to try to address today with the really high-level panelists that accepted our invitation is how do we guarantee equal and effective protection of workers against chemical, in particular against glyphosate. So how this panel is going to be organized, because it's a really technical topic, we're going to start by a presentation from Tony Monsieur, who is a senior researcher at the European Trade Union Institute in the Health and Safety Unit, a colleague of mine, who is going to set the scene of where we are in terms of knowledge, but also politically. After that, when we all have some common understanding of the issue, we're going to move towards more roundtable with three participants. So Enrico Somaglia, Deputy Secretary General at European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Unions, representing more the worker side. Is going to be joined by Isaline Ossieur, who is a junior advisor in the Social Affairs Department at Business Europe, representing more the employer side. And for the political components, I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Mathieu, who is the MEP at the group of the Greens and European Free Alliance at the European Parliament. So first, and without further ado, I will ask Tony to start his presentation. You have half an hour if you wish, and sorry in advance if I'm a bit annoying with the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Aude. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me in this panel. And so I will introduce you the issue about unequal protection against occupational risks with the case of glyphosate. So if we try to understand why workers die at work because of their bad working conditions, the first reason are occupational cancers. So as you can see, more than 50% of the deaths are due to occupational cancers. Then we have other factors like circulatory diseases, respiratory diseases, and we also have accidents. And most of the time we're seeing that accidents at work are the first reason for workers to die at work. But as you can see, that's only a few percent, and that the first real reason that's occupational cancers, that because workers are exposed to carcinogens at work. So these are the numbers, and as you can see, we have more than 100,000 deaths each year in the EU that are caused by occupational cancers. So the numbers are quite high in each country. Altogether, 100,000 workers losing their life each year due to exposure to carcinogens at work. So this is the result of a survey that is being done in France. That's the summer survey. It's done by medical doctors surveying workers, a representative sample of workers. And so we can see from that survey that we have an unequal exposure to carcinogens among different sectors. As you can see, some sectors and workers in those sectors are more exposed to carcinogens compared to other sectors. And for example, in the construction, in the industry, in the agriculture sector, workers are more exposed to carcinogens compared to the average workers. And for example, in the services, they are less exposed to carcinogens. And today, we would like to talk about a particular example of carcinogen, which is important for the agriculture sector. And that's the case of glyphosate. So what is glyphosate? That's one of the most widely used active substance in herbicides. It is used to kill weeds, and it acts by inhibiting a plant enzyme. It is a well-known product used in the Roundup, well-known from Monsanto and now Bayer. So it is used in agriculture. It is used also in municipalities to kill weeds in public area like the parks, but it is also used in private gardens by people like us to kill weeds in their garden. So why is glyphosate the #1 herbicide in the world? First of all, it's non-selective, so it works on all plants, and it can eliminate almost any type of weeds. It is systemic, so it means that it migrates into all plant tissues, including the roots, and it's non-residual. So it means that it's rapidly inactivated in the soil. It's not expensive, so the price in 2020 was about 30 euro per hectare, and it's very easy to use. So that's why it's really the #1 herbicide in the world. So here's some numbers on the volumes that are used. As you can see, more than 40,000 tons of glyphosate were sold in the EU in 2017. That's the last data that we have. And so it represents 38% of all the herbicide sales in the EU. And it's #1 in almost all EU countries. Just for your information, in September 2000, Monsanto's patent for glyphosate, the active substance, expired. And then from that time, it is now produced by different companies that you can see here. And in March 2015, IARC, so the International Association on Research on Cancer, has classified glyphosate in the group 2A, which is a carcinogen, probably carcinogenic to human, more precisely. And of course, the role of IARC is only to answer one question: is the substance carcinogenic or not? That's all they do. They look at the intrinsic properties of different substances, and they do a so-called monograph where they collect all the data about the substance. And in this case, they have collected around 1,000 studies. And of course, the panel that is evaluating the substances are independent experts, recognized experts. And in this case, so they have classified clearly glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. That's group 2A. According to the IARC classification, it corresponds to a classification carcinogenic 1B in the EU system. In 2017, we had the Monsanto papers. So they were released as part of a lawsuit in the US. So as glyphosate victims, they sue Monsanto. They were claiming that their cancer was due to the use of glyphosate. And as you know, in the US, they have this system that they can ask for the internal documents of the company. And that's what they did in the US. And the papers, the Monsanto papers, were released, and it was shown that Monsanto manipulated the scientific debate and misled the public about the hazardous properties of glyphosate. So some internal studies were hidden. And also it showed that the behavior of Monsanto was debatable. They organize, for example, ghost writing. So they ask some scientific to write scientific paper showing that glyphosate was okay. And these papers were signed by well-known scientists that were paid to put their name on papers written by Monsanto. So that's the kind of things that were shown by the Monsanto paper. And also they organized the so-called Let Nothing Go campaign. So it means that all opponents to glyphosate were, let's say, surveyed or were looked at by people from Monsanto. And each time they were publishing something, Monsanto reacted immediately on the press or by some other publication. So just to show the behavior of Monsanto. How come that glyphosate is used as a pesticide, is authorized as an herbicide in the EU? So we have in the EU several agencies that are tasked to assess active substance to be used in pesticides and to decide whether or not they can be put on the EU market. And two different things are assessed. First, the intrinsic properties of the substance, that's the so-called hazard. And the agency doing that is ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency based in Helsinki. And then we have another agency, that's the Food Agency, EFSA, located in Parma, Italy. And that agency looks at the risks, so the possibility of harm in humans and environment. And in December 2017, those two agencies assessed glyphosate because the license expired in 2017, and ECHA concluded that glyphosate is not classified as a carcinogen, and EFSA concluded that glyphosate used in herbicides is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic hazard to humans. So based on these two assessments, the Commission reauthorized glyphosate for sale up to December 2022. So it means that glyphosate got a license of 5 years, on an extra license of 5 years on the EU market. So we are almost in now December 2022, and so it means that a new assessment of the glyphosate has to start, and in reality already started. And of course, this new assessment needs to take into account all the new scientific information that we have on glyphosate since 2017. Just to mention that in 2018, Monsanto was bought by Bayer for $60 billion. That we had in the US this court case that I've talked about earlier, and we had these American gardener that had a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma so a blood cancer, and he blamed glyphosate for these diseases. And in the US, he won the case against Bayer, and Bayer had to pay him $78 million. So that's in the US. So in the US, glyphosate was clearly recognized as the cause of occupational cancers. In 2019, we had new scientific studies showing that exposed workers have higher cancer risks. And I just mentioned here two important studies. The first one showing that workers with high exposure to glyphosate-based herbicide have 31% higher risk of developing this lung cancer, this blood cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And another study also showing that more than 3,000 farm workers using glyphosate in the EU also have an increased risk of developing these blood cancer. So these are the latest studies. ECHA and EFSA had to redo the work that they did in 2017. So they had to reassess all the data available. And that's a very long process that I will not detail here. I will just go directly to the recent results. And ECHA had to reassess the intrinsic properties, so the hazard of glyphosate. And again, they concluded, despite all the evidence, that glyphosate is not classified as a carcinogen. So it has a classification for other properties. It is toxic to aquatic life, for example, but it is not carcinogenic to humans. EFSA had to also reassess glyphosate, this time for the risks. But recently, EFSA announced that due to the high number of comments and contributions that they received in the public consultation, they cannot keep the original timeline, and they are delayed in their assessment. And so they announced that they will give their assessment of the risks only in July 2023, and their assessment was originally due in July 2022. So it means that de facto, the decision from the Commission to ban or not glyphosate is postponed to the end of 2023, and glyphosate has got another year of authorization to be on the EU market. Despite that, I need also to explain that the active substance is authorized at EU level, and then each country has the possibility to authorize or to ban the herbicide themselves. So it means the active substance plus the so-called adjuvant, so the other substances that all together, the mixture that form the herbicide. We have some countries that have banned glyphosate in the EU, that's Luxembourg, but also other countries have already banned glyphosate or are planning to ban it. And we also have some partial bans, like in Belgium or in the Netherlands, for example. And we also have some cities that have decided to use the precautionary principle and already to ban glyphosate in their municipalities. So, of course, when ECHA again assessed glyphosate and found out and concluded that glyphosate is not a carcinogen, the agency was of course criticized. And you have here some of the reactions from, for example, EFAT, the trade unions from the agriculture sector at EU level, but also some NGOs or some big newspapers that, of course, criticized that situation. Just to conclude, I just would like to remind that farmers are more exposed to carcinogens at work compared to other sectors. It's clear that the credibility of the EU agencies assessing glyphosate is clearly under question. We can say clearly that the controversy about glyphosate is still there, it's not solved. And we certainly need independent international assessments to, I would say, restore the confidence that EU citizens can have on these scientific assessments of hazardous substances. And that's also the conclusion that was reached by a commission, an independent commission in France. They came to that conclusion that there is indeed all those questions about the independency of the regulatory agencies that we have on the EU when a lot of money is at stake. Just to remind, glyphosate is #1 herbicide in Europe and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you again for this really good presentation. And I think now we all have a general, at least, or basic understanding of the situation. So I would like to move more in the second part of the panel, which is a roundtable with our 3 panelists. And my first question will be more maybe to reflect on, so we have seen that there is a lot of problem with ECHA, and this is a European problem, and I would like to place it more also in other European policies. So we have the European Commission with the Farm to Fork strategy for a fair, healthy and environmentally friendly food system, which aim to reduce the overall use and risk of chemical pesticides by 50% between now and 2030. Considering what Tony told us about the fact that glyphosate is the top one herbicides used in the world and in Europe. The question, and so the strategy should benefit the workers, especially the ones exposed to pesticides, such as glyphosate. Therefore, and this is a question for all the panelists here, according to you, what is the relevance and the importance of discussing the ban and or the renewal of glyphosate in the context of the Farm to Fork strategy and more generally to the green transition? What is the importance of this in the bigger picture? And maybe I will put on the spot Sarah Mathieu to start, and then I will give the floor to the social partners.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very clear that the use of glyphosate is really linked to the highly intensive agriculture model that we've seen that is not sustainable, and of course that we move away from if it's up to the Greens. And that's of course exactly the transition that ideally the Farm to Fork strategy should deliver, that we phase out of that agro-industrial model, that we move to a sustainable model that's really good for consumers, for producers, and also for biodiversity. For consumers, because of course it will produce more healthy food. For the farmers, because we need to make sure that they get a fair economic return, and of course also good for biodiversity to make sure that we protect nature. And I think, well, if you ask me as a green, there's really no place for the mass use of pesticides and herbicides like glyphosate in a sustainable agricultural model. And I think that indeed there's overwhelming evidence that shows how harmful it is when it comes to people, when it comes to animals, when it comes to the environment. We know, and I mean, Tony has mentioned it, there are many studies saying that, well, it's actually harmful for our hormones. It can have an adverse impact on reproduction, on our fertility. And it's not just a question of human health either. We've really seen also a lot of studies when it comes to high long-term risk for animals, both, for instance, cows, sheep, but of course, I think very enigmatic are also the bees when we've been campaigning on this as really an impact on animals, but also on other herbs and plants as such. And well, I mean, Tony mentioned there's a long-going scientific debate on whether or not glyphosate is actually carcinogenic. And indeed, we've seen the process, you mentioned it very clearly, where some of the European agencies still don't seem to see the light, honestly, on the evidence that is there vis-a-vis the United States, where it's very clear that those that have been impacted by this have been remunerated. And so, of course, there is a correlation, or otherwise, you wouldn't have repayments from Bayer and Monsanto. And I think it's really important, and we as Greens always put that forward, the precautionary principle. I mean, if there's even the slightest doubt, then we shouldn't have this on our market. We should protect people's health and not, the economic interests of big corporations. And of course, we know we shouldn't underestimate the high pressure there is when it comes to lobby, when it comes to the industry who wants to continue making profits out of the sale of glyphosate and out of the model that we have in our agriculture as it is. And indeed, the scandal that we saw with the assessment report of glyphosate really shows how far they are willing to go. The Monsanto papers indeed say the same. We shouldn't be naive about this, and it's good that these things come to the forefront and see the light. And it's proof of how far this lobby is willing to go to protect their own interests. So, I mean, if you ask me, I think a complete ban of glyphosate is really the only way to make sure that we protect the health of our agricultural workers and of our environment as a whole, of course. I mean, there are so many studies that show that indeed the exposure to glyphosate is much more common, of course, when it comes to farmers, their families that are living on the farm, even their children. So, I mean, the impact is huge. And I think, we need to also think about how farmers nowadays are really locked in a vicious circle. They're spending more and more money on these pesticides, on these fertilizers, to make sure that they don't get a decrease in their yield. But, the more they use the products, the further they have to go in this. And I mean, we have to get them out. I think, the current model that's really post-war, it was designed to feed a fast-growing population after the war. We've had a lot of productivity gains in agriculture, but it hasn't really benefited the farmers, honestly. And I think we can see that when it comes to their economical position, if you will, and their social well-being. I mean, it's the other actors in the food chain that are really profiting from this model. It's the agri-food industry, it's the retail, also the consumers, because of course we are gotten used to having quite cheap food, I have to say. When you look at how we are producing it actually. So for me, it's quite clear we need to go to a different model of agriculture, and there is no place for substances like glyphosate in that. And I mean, that's important for the economical model of our farmers, but it's also really important to protect their health.
Thank you very much for stressing the importance of according for the Greens, of course, the complete ban of glyphosate, not only for workers, but for society and the environment. And indeed, after I would like to follow up with the question of the alternative. But first of all, before that, I would like to give the floor to maybe the people, the social partners, and Isaline Ossier, maybe to reflect on, once again, how the question of the renewal or the ban takes place in the bigger context and the bigger political movement.
Thank you. And thank you also to Tony for the very informative and illustrative presentation on glyphosate. It is quite, as has been mentioned numerous times, quite a technical topic. So it's always good to have a brief introduction to it before we start a more political discussion on this topic as well. Many things have been already said with regards to regulation at EU level and the underlying scientific evidence, of course, and the maybe scandals that have taken place outside of the EU and maybe sometimes in the EU as well. I think from our side, it's very clear that a correct classification is, of course, necessary for all types of chemicals. And we have, of course, the institutions in the EU who are responsible for that and who have this entire procedure as we've seen. And it's important to give them the credit also that they deserve, of course. And correct classification is really necessary to have the correct regulations afterwards. So when we are discussing a total ban on certain chemicals, for example, as has been mentioned by Sarah, it's important that we have the right scientific evidence to back this up. And there have been numerous scientific papers cited here today, but it has been clear, of course, to I think everyone here present, that the scientific evidence is not really consistent. There is a lot of contradicting scientific evidence underlying this problem, and I would just like to make it clear that the process needs to be consistent, needs to be clear in order to move forward with proper regulation on this important chemical. So that is just my starting point. I would also like to say that, of course, what we're here discussing today mostly impacts the agricultural sector. I think it's great that we have the trade unions from the agriculture sector here present today. I think that will lead to a very interesting debate, because indeed it is one of the most prevalent chemicals used, pesticides used within the agricultural process. Now, of course, this has benefits and this has downsides for the farmers on the one hand, and of course also for everyone else involved in this entire process. So we've talked about the entire food chain who's really involved in this process. It's clear that at the moment, where it stands, glyphosates are probably the only viable option that farmers have to date to be cost effective in the way that they produce their products. At the moment, there is not really a viable alternative or a sustainable alternative that is available on the markets for farmers to use. Of course, this is, again, a very technical topic that we can go into, but there needs to be more support for farmers in this regard to have the available resources to be able to use in their production. So before we talk about this ban or this strict regulation on this chemical, it needs to be clear that there needs to be a support, a framework for farmers to fall back on. And this is not only with regards to financial support, but really with regards to, is there a viable alternative available that they can use? And this is really essential in our viewpoint. So also keep the confidence in the European food safety, in the European food security, and to also maintain, of course, the high standards that we have within the European production system. Now, there have been several mentions of American examples here. Of course, I think it's important for me to underline that not only is there a farm to fork, strategy, there is also a considerate occupational safety and health legislation present in the EU, which is not present, of course, in the US. And this is something that really, I think, needs to be underlined more when we're having this discussion and when we're talking about the safety of our workers, which is, of course, something that is important to the employers as well. I think I'll stop there, just to keep in time frame as well, Odd.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for this consideration and emphasizing the importance to take in consideration all scientific evidence when we take our decision and not disregard any of the research. This is indeed important. And I will, of course, follow up then on the alternative and the harsh legislation. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Enrico for same question and the other, expressing yourself on more the general thing and what is the importance here of the ban or the renewal in the general politic.
So the ban of glyphosate would be a major step in the establishment of a more sustainable agriculture sector. It would represent really, a milestone, I would say, for the simple reason that the glyphosate is indeed the most widely used herbicide in Europe and globally. And Tony has explained the figures very well. It is produced in about 100 manufacturing companies. Mainly, half of these are placed in China. And in Europe, it represents about 33% of the total sales of pesticides. So banning glyphosate would mean really changing the way we are doing agriculture. And this means also moving towards an agricultural sector which is more sustainable, with less pesticides, less hazardous chemicals. And of course, this is really one of the main reasons why it is so important to ban glyphosate. The second reason, which is also very important, and it's, I would say, the predominant reason for EFAT, is that there is growing evidence that glyphosate products constitute a carcinogenic risk to humans. The IARC study assessment in 2015 has been really very, very important and emblematic, but there have been many other studies that followed, like the one from the Ramazzini Institute, or many others that have been presented as submitted in this current renewal process. So it's a pesticide that it is quite evident that it produces non-Hodgkin lymphoma and other kind of cancers to blood. So this means that we have millions of workers in Europe that on a daily basis are exposed really to a chemical product that is damaging their health in a number of serious ways. And these workers include agricultural workers, but not only. We shouldn't forget about public workers like park staff or gardeners, and also forestry workers as well. So there are a number of workers that are daily exposed to these pesticides. And Sarah is totally right. We should apply the precautionary principle in Europe. This is what we have to do. And I think there is enough evidence to stop with the use of this product. The problem we have is that, of course, and in this I agree with Aline, we need a transition. We need a transition to a more agricultural sector that includes the ban of glyphosate. And for that, we need a governance. We need a governance with the involvement of social partners. We need resources for farmers, because we are asking farmers to change their way of doing agriculture. This is absolutely important. And farmers are squeezed by an agricultural model, an agro-food system that squeeze them, because the only way they have to have some margins is really to produce in an unsustainable way, because we are squeezed from the bottom with a number of multinational companies that govern the seed market, and they are squeezed also from the top with the increased bargaining power of retailers and the multinational companies operating in the food sector. So in this way, if you are asking them to change the way they are doing agriculture, they need resources. But resources need to be associated with the social conditionalities, as we have achieved in CAP. That means no money to employers that don't respect workers' rights. This is for us a standing principle that we defend, and we defend also in the context of the green transition, because the green transition must be an opportunity also to improve working conditions in a sector that, as we know, is really marked by huge levels of undeclared work, around 60% in Europe when it comes to the agriculture sector, to precarious work. So we need to ensure that really the environmental transition that we support becomes an opportunity to improve working conditions and not an additional threat. We don't need additional threats for agricultural workers. They've already faced so many, in particular over the last few years with COVID, and now the impact of Ukraine, of the war in Ukraine on the agro-food sector. Unfortunately, we have still a lot of hopes for this renewal process. What is happening now with this assessment of ECA is not something that we welcome, is something that we strongly oppose. And we really hope that EFSA will assess all the studies that have been submitted and will completely change, will not renew the license for the use of glyphosate, because it's really time to move to a more sustainable agricultural sector, which means less pesticides, and therefore a very good news for agricultural workers and also for the environment, because we talk about the pesticides that has been proven to be really dangerous also for aquatic life. So this is given for granted. Already this should be enough, because when we drink water, so there are already many proof of the fact that when we find glyphosate in the urines of human beings, particularly in some regions where we have a kind of intense agriculture. So it's really time to stop with that. But indeed, to do that, we need a transition, and we need a governance that entails resources, entails upskilling, reskilling. It entails also a different vision, because we cannot have just a sustainable agriculture sector here in Europe, forgetting about what is happening around the globe. So we need to have a completely different approach to trade agreements as well. Because what is happening at the moment is that in Europe, we still produce pesticides that have been banned, but we produce them and we export them to third countries. And then we import foodstuff which has been produced with those pesticides. So this is totally an hypocrisy that exists at European level, and also to protect the competition of our agricultural sector and the interests of farmers. It's absolutely important that we have this global approach. So there is a governance needs an holistic approach. It's not only about a ban, it's about much more, but we need the priority should be the protection of health and safety.
Thank you very much. So for the overall context and what I hear here, because I'm a positive person, is I think there is a consensus of there might be ways to move forward. It's just we do not fully agree on the conditions and what is necessary for this transition, what is the state of the research, and what should be the options and all of that. So in that respect, I would like to keep going with the question of the ban and the transition, and what could be the viable options. Because what I hear here is that, well, we want alternatives. There is a question of the cost, and as Tony said, it's quite cheap. As Isaline underlined, this is a cost-effective one. So the question here, we have many questions. The first one is like, do we have actually numbers of how much would be the cost of switching completely to other alternatives that are less or non-harmful for workers and the environment? What are the viable options, if any? Because they might be considering that some countries have already banned it, so they must have found a solution, right? And especially for the employer side, what do you think could be the help in the transition towards maybe less cost-effective, but more like worker-friendly and environmental-friendly solutions, even if it's more expensive? How far do you think we should go? What can be the mechanism in place? And I just would like quickly to just draw one little remark. What I hear as well, it reminds me a bit of the discussion at some point we have with asbestos. And for a really long time, it has been seen as an element that was really like also cheap. It was like a very cost effective, but it was harmful for the workers. There was a question about like, was it actually harmful or not? What was all the research and all of this? And we have now the proof that it was, and this is now banned. So we found a solution. So just to say that maybe in a couple of years, I hope it will be the same situation. But what will be the viable options and how do we get there? And here I would like to start maybe with Isaline. What do you think how do we reach there, even if it's not cost effective?
Thank you, Aude. Maybe I'll just start with the comparison with asbestos. I think you introduced it quite well, meaning that from our side currently, we don't see the comparison yet with asbestos until, I'll once again underline it, until the scientific evidence is fully there to back it up. Otherwise, there's a danger of drawing comparisons between chemicals that are not comparable. So that will be my main item on that. With regards to viable options, this is really something that we're very much looking into and something that's very, of course, concerning to us. To be very clear, from the employer's perspective, we are not, as you rightly mentioned, we are not against improvement. We are not against making it more sustainable. We are not against changing some things in order to provide for more protection where it is needed. So indeed, you're right in that assessment that we do agree on that line. It's indeed on what the time frame is for it, how it should be dealt with, and what are the options available to us currently. And when we talk about cost benefit or what is cost viable, that's the biggest issue that we see right now, is that there is no one solution, there is no viable alternative at the moment. Now, I think this panel and this conference actually comes at a very opportune time because, as you might know, today, of course, the several commissioners introduced their new proposal to eliminate 50% of pesticides for 2030, which of course is something that is the key element of what we're discussing today. And I was happy to note as well that in there, the Commission has taken a very supportive approach with regards to, they see that there is need for more support for everyone involved in this chain. And again, this does not only come with regards to finance, but also invest in research and invest in finding new alternatives, finding things that is viable not only from a cost perspective, but also indeed from a protection perspective. So I think, to conclude from my side, I think at the moment we're not there, which is why, again, a full ban on glyphosates is not, for employers, is just not viable at this stage. We need more transitory mechanisms for that. And again, we need scientific evidence. There's a whole bunch, an array of things that we need before we can come to that assessment, before we can come to that regulation. But I should say that, at least from our point of view, we see that it is going in a positive direction to not solely focus on being ambitious in our sustainable goals, but also being ambitious in our competitiveness goals and keeping the European market competitive, as Enrico rightly mentioned previously, with the holistic approach. We cannot take Europe as a separate actor, of course, in this conversation, because the rest of the world might not go along with us in this conversation. So in order to keep, and of course, again, this whole contradiction or gap that we have in our regulation with regards to trade agreements is something that we're very much aware of course, as well. So it's good to look at this from a holistic perspective. I will echo what Enrico said there, and to take a more broad approach to this and to take all of these different facets into consideration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I, once again, very happy to hear that the day we have viable solutions, that can be reconsidered, and we want to go in the right direction, in the same direction. And on that note, I was wondering if maybe Enrico could share if he is aware of some practices or what is the state here, if there is any viable alternatives and what they are.
Yeah, so 2 points I think here. The first one, so first of all, I think there is enough scientific evidence. The problem we have is that the procedure of EFSA and ECHA And in general, the procedure that we have at European level is just not transparent enough and doesn't work in practice. I was not familiar with this process. I became familiar over the last year when I started approaching myself to this issue of glyphosate again with the new renewal. And knowing how EFSA and ECHA work was quite shocking for me, because it's completely run through the assessment, which are mainly done by the companies that produce glyphosate. And those that are independent studies don't get a privileged position throughout the assessment. And this is for me a major concern, because also according to what we have seen now with this new assessment of ECHA, it seems that some studies that were proving the fact that rats exposed to glyphosate were having cancers, were producing cancers in a more easy way, were completely disregarded in a very not really in a scientific way, just because they said that there was not the link, or they were not able to find the link, but the link was clearly clarified in the study. So the scientific evidence is there. Unfortunately, this is not about scientific approaches. This is very much political, and there is a lack of political will at the moment when it comes to glyphosate. And the lack of political will is driven by the fact that the agrochemical companies and lobbies, they are really influential, and they are also using what is happening in Ukraine to stop and to all the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. So in a way, we welcome what has happened today with the issue of the SUR regulation. This is a good news, but still we already see that there are some shortcomings in the text because of this influence that the agrochemical companies and lobbies were able to apply. And also when it comes to alternatives, which is the second issue, also the alternatives in a way already exist. This includes agronomic practices, it includes mechanical and biological weed control, it includes animal grazing, it includes natural herbicides, it includes agroecology practices, and there is enough proof of the fact that you can keep the economic sustainability of a farm, but by also ensuring the fact that you produce really without pesticides, but just through agronomic and ecological practices. So again, it's a matter of a process. It's a matter of having the right transition. It's a matter of having the right governance. And you do that only if there is really political will to achieve that. So today it's a first step, because I think this SUR regulation is an opening, because having a binding targets to reduce pesticides used by 50% from here to 2030, it's an important target. We need to try to improve that legislation that has already, as we have seen in the first assessment that we did this morning, some major loopholes. And then glyphosate would really represent a major step in the right direction, in the spirit of the Farm to Fork strategy, which is the way to become more sustainable, also in view of what is happening with the war in Ukraine. Because the war in Ukraine is casting new light really on the fragilities and all the vulnerabilities of our agro-food system, including our dependency on the import of on fertilizers, on pesticides, etc., etc. So the Farm to Fork strategy is the way forward. This is showing us the way for a more sustainable agriculture sector. And of course, from a trade union perspective, we also want to have social considerations in it.
Thank you very much for this remark and showing that there is option that we need to go and explore further. And on this, maybe like Sarah Mathieu, can you reflect on what can be the role here of the institution, maybe the parliament and your group in supporting these alternatives and trying to make it really like economic viable for everyone? So yeah, to accompany this.
Maybe to start with, because of course you mentioned asbestos, and it's one of the files that I'm very active on in the parliament, and I do indeed see some comparison there. I have to regretfully say, because when I looked into the history of what went on with asbestos for many, many years, it was already clear, both for the industry and for the authorities, that there was a huge problem and that it was carcinogenic. And it took us such a long time to finally have that ban. And in the meanwhile, so many workers got sick and died. And I mean, honestly, I see the comparison with what Monsanto is doing. It's also for such a long time denying what a lot of us have already seen, and indeed the studies have shown, and it's just a huge lobby machine. But well, when it comes to the alternatives, and of course the alternatives are there. I mean, do you think that the Commission would come up with a proposal that would say we are going to halve the use of pesticides if they would think that it would harm the economic, return of agriculture in such a way? No, of course not. They are not completely crazy. So I'm glad that indeed the pressure that some have tried to put on the Commission when it comes to, for instance, references to the war, which I don't think makes sense, honestly, and I'm glad that Timmermans agrees with us there, that it hasn't, weakened what the Commission wants to do. But of course, it's just the beginning. It's the first step. Okay, we're halving our use of pesticides. I mean, I think it's very clear what I'm saying and what the Greens are saying is in the long run, we should get rid of it. And then, of course, we know that there's another model that works. And that is even going to be more interesting for farmers. They will get more economic returns if they go for organic farming. They will be much happier also, honestly. I mean, we can see now that the way the system is working, the subsidies are really going to the big agro industry. A lot of the farmers that are still in that, I would say, conservative system have really trouble keeping their heads above water. There are many, suicides amongst farmers because of their lack of perspective and of future. And I think that's very, very worrying, because these are really people that are providing our nurture and our food that we need to keep alive. So yes, we need to support them in that transition. Of course we need to. And of course, I also agree with you, Enrico, that there need to be, some conditionality, also social conditionality. I'm very happy. That's one of the few things that we got in the CAP reform that I'm quite, happy and proud about, even though I think it should be a given. I mean, it's a bit crazy that we have to say, oh, you only get subsidies if you actually just abide by the rules. But still, I guess it's necessary in a sector where indeed it's still difficult when it comes to, having the normal working conditions and protection of workers due to standards that we have. And, they have a right to have those standards for sure. So, yeah, I mean, there is another way. We should support farmers in that transition. And I think in the long run, it will benefit them, it will benefit our health, and it will benefit the environment.
Thank you very much on that. And I'm happy to see that on the question of the renewal on the ban, we once again want to all go in the right direction. There are options we need to much digging and explore. But in the meantime, sadly, workers are still exposed at the moment that we speak, exposed to glyphosate, exposed to other pesticides that provoke then like skin irritation, allergies, poisoning, reproductive disorders, sterility, all of that, cancer. And the question is, what do we do for them? And I know that Isaline said that we have a really strong legal framework in Europe. So the question is, how do we protect the workers against this risk now, but also bearing in mind that in the sector that we are discussing here, the agricultural sector, we have a lot of temporary, seasonal, and migrant workers, which means that sometimes they are not aware of those risks and they are not benefiting from the adequate prevention. And the time and the day there is all the consequences of the exposure kicking in, sometimes years along the line, they're not in the country anymore. How do they get compensation? So how do we protect effectively these workers with all this consideration right now, today, against these risks? And here, I'll let you decide who wants to start.
We want to hear from you.
Okay. Excellent. I'm surprised you want to hear from me, but okay, excellent. No, indeed. With regards to the protection of workers, of course, in every sector, this is not only about the agriculture sector. As Enrico already mentioned, this substance is, of course, used in other sectors as well, but most dominantly in the agriculture sector. protection of workers is always a basic working condition. It's always a basic right of any worker, and that has been a part of EU legislation since the Framework Directive of '89. But as you also mentioned now, of course, with the developments at the ILO, we see this progressing in a more global direction as well. The Framework Directive really is the basis for everything here, and it provides for very clear instructions, both for employers, but I also have to always mention in this regard for employees as well. So of course there are things that employers always need to take into consideration, such as the training of their employees, making sure that they know what the risks are so they have the knowledge of it, making sure that protective equipment, for example, is provided when they perform their different activities. Those are the obligations that lie on the employer. Now, this is a shared obligation with the employee as well, of course. It's up to the employee to make sure that they use the equipment that they get in the right way, of course, that they come to these trainings and implement them correctly, that they do everything they can with the means that they've received, of course, to also protect themselves from these hazards at work. We have a strict regulation on chemicals in the workplace, and this is always progressing. This is always added with new substances, with stronger and stricter exposure limit values on these substances. So there is quite an extensive framework already present at the EU. I think it's also important to say that in agriculture specifically, there is a lot of extra regulatory provisions for the protection of workers. For example, if it's only like the mandatory official training in the safety of applying certain chemicals. We also have the regular checks of crops and the regular checks of the protective equipment that is being used. So the agriculture sector really is a sector that knows the hazards that are present in the sector and is actively always trying to improve upon this. Now, when it comes to these particular workers, such as, for example, seasonal workers or migrant workers, we know that they need more information, they need more guidance because of the precarious situation that they are in. And this, again, I will repeat it until in perpetuity, but this again just is based on this shared responsibility. It is of course up to the employer to make sure that they have all the equipment that is needed, and it is up to the seasonal worker as well, of course, to make sure that if they have questions, if something is unclear, that they go to their employer as well. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll leave it up to the trade unions to respond.
Thank you for emphasizing that. It's true, we have an extensive legal framework. I'm a lawyer. I'm happy with that. The question is maybe more on the enforcement and compliance, and maybe then Enrico can reflect on that part as well.
Yes, enforcement and compliance, which is indeed very complicated in agriculture. It's a sector where we have very high levels of precarious work, very high levels of undeclared work. So it's not the same as in other sectors of the economy. Also, when it comes to inspections, it's not like going to a production plant where you find 6,000 workers in the same place. No, they are working in rural areas and sometimes with deplorable working conditions. And this is sometimes very difficult to be assessed and to be checked by competent authorities. But I think the best way to really to protect these workers, first of all, is to reduce the use of pesticides. So this is the best way to protect them from the risk linked to the use of pesticides. And the second priority is to try to really fight against undeclared work, because there is a strong link between undeclared work and the risk to health and safety. Because if you work undeclared, then you cannot report any violation of your rights, any risk for your health and safety, without risking a dismissal. or even a deportation if you are a migrant workers and undocumented migrant workers. So again, an holistic approach. And then I think we need a set of measures which are social policy measures, but also mixed with some other measures. For example, for us, it's very important to strengthen labor inspections, and we propose at European level to have an initiative, even a binding initiative on labor inspections that really are improving the level of inspections, improving the powers of national labor inspectorates, even with more resources. We know that they are understaffed, labor inspectorates in Europe, and also ensuring that there is a crossing of relevant data. For example, in agriculture, it would be sufficient to cross the extension of the land, the output, the agricultural output, how much production you do, and the number of workers, the number of declared working hours, to really assess if there is a problem linked to undeclared work or unrecorded working hours. And then I think it's important that we fully implement the social conditionality of the common agricultural policy, because there are in particularly two directives that are in the health and safety framework, the general health and safety framework directive, but also the one on work equipment. So ensuring that this social conditionality is respected, it means looking at the money and hitting in a way the money that farmers get, and I can tell you that they rely a lot on this EU money. So ensuring that this is respected would be a very effective tool also to prevent the risk linked to pesticide use. And then I think we need also to facilitate the reporting of occupational diseases linked to pesticides. This is a major issue that we have, because only, I think, in France and in Italy, only these two countries officially recognize Parkinson diseases to be linked to farm work, and this is not acceptable. So in this respect, much more has to be done, and we will try to do it also within the framework of the sustainable use of pesticides regulation. One key demand that we have as EFAT is also to ensure that every farm worker has official documentation on the kind of pesticides that they have used during their work activity, because indeed then they maybe have left the profession and the disease appear after a number of years. So it's not easy for them to demonstrate what kind of products they have used, or even evidence that the product is dangerous or carcinogenic. The evidence comes later. So in this respect, it's also very important that we have this kind of documentation. And last but not least, I mean, it goes without saying that from a trade union perspective, we need to keep our effort of organizing migrant workers, seasonal workers. Is a very dangerous task, very complicated work, but we have some successful stories also in this respect. And what the European Union could do is to provide fundings to EU to trade union counseling services, because they are doing an excellent job, which is important also for the public society as a whole, because they are really providing information on their basic rights, trade union rights, but also social rights as well. And they are the first source of information for these migrant workers, and most of the time they are really facing deplorable working and housing conditions, and they are really under threat. So this is again another important point from our point of view that would help also in protecting from the risk linked to pesticides and in general to improve working condition and health and safety standards.
Thank you very much, Enrico. And I like how they self-monitor by ending with a question to the next speaker. But also, I want to emphasize that here we have a complementary answer. So Iselin really emphasized all the framework. And I think Enrico, what he did is really interesting, is showing that the framework is nothing if we don't have other measures and labor inspection, and we fight undeclared work, and we have like the social conditionality and all of this. So, and also the recognition of occupational disease, which is fundamental to give really like material to the prevention when it fails, right? Sarah, I will leave you the last word to maybe reflect and also pick up the question or the idea that Enrico put on the table.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just first to reiterate, and of course you're not going to be surprised if I say that the best prevention for workers in agriculture is of course to stop using the pesticides. But well, we're not there yet. We will fight to get there. And indeed, we have a very good framework when it comes to health and safety. And I mean, it's something that we can be proud of. I think, when it comes to European legislation, because it really guarantees those rights. It guarantees that minimum safety and health requirements throughout the Union. And I mean, that's of course on paper. Then you need to put it on the ground and make sure that it's actually implemented. And indeed, I think it's difficult when it comes to agriculture, for instance, because of the seasonal workers. I think it's very important that they have the information on their rights in this regard. We recently had a talk with ELA, the European Campaign Labor Agency, and well, they did really a campaign on seasonal workers, also in agriculture, and I think that the work that they are doing is really valuable. Where indeed they point out to these specific workers their rights. For instance, when it comes to skin contact with hazardous liquids, and of course that they have the right to protective equipment, for instance, gloves, suits, masks, goggles, etc., to be provided to them free of charge. And of course, I agree that trade unions there have a very important role as well to play to give that information and to make sure that they actually know these rights. But then again, what really alarms me, if I am honest, is that there are actually a lot of studies now that say that protective equipment is not working at all. And then, of course, that's a huge issue because, well, there are some studies that actually say that these pesticides, they're, of course, designed to pass through cell membranes. That means, for instance, if you're wearing protective gear, it will also penetrate your protective gear. And then, of course, you can wear as much gear as you want, but you won't be protected in the way that you should be. And I think that, well, is very worrying. And that brings me to the fact that maybe safe use of pesticides is really a fiction. So, you know, that's even just under the assumption that they are using the gear. Because, I mean, we also have to be aware of the fact that these working conditions are very difficult. I mean, imagine let's talk about climate change as well, very hot summers where you have to put all of this stuff on and do a hard day's work in the fields. I mean, I can understand that for some workers, this might not be top of mind, or they might not even realize the consequences when they are not using it. And I mean, maybe we should even look at a bigger picture when we're talking about those seasonal workers. We know that working conditions for them are often not up to standards, but it's not just about the working conditions, it goes even further. I mean, often they are actually used as modern slaves, I would say. They don't have, living conditions that are up to standards. They don't have electricity, they don't have running water, they don't have sanitation. They have to pay to be able to have a work contract, etc. And I mean, all of that is really, again, linked to this agricultural model where we are using them as cheap labor forces, whilst I think we should really be focusing on creating quality jobs for all and, having a different agricultural model.
Thank you very much for these final remarks. And on this, I would like to end the roundtable for now. So just big round of applause, because that's a really complex topic with difficult questions. And so thank you, first of all, to all of you. A big round of applause before opening the floor, because well done to all of you. And now I know it's the end of the day, but we still have some time for questions. So I will invite all the people watching us online to put it into the Q&A for the next couple of minutes. And before that, I would like also to open the floor to people within the room if you have any questions. And please state for whom your question is. We have a first question here and then a second here.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Sarah King, and I work in the Secretariat of the Workers Group at the European Economic and Social Committee. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Really, really interesting discussion. A couple of reflections, and there may also be a little bit of a question. But just, I mean, I think mainly, directed towards Isaline. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. on the issue about banning, I mean, and cost effectiveness, I wonder what, in terms of research, because of course we've been saying that there's mixed evidence, and in terms of research, I'd like to know what industry is doing in terms of feeding into this research, because as has been said, I think at the end of the day, the best way in which to protect people is not to have it. So and when we talk about cost effectiveness, I think we have to bring into the discussion about cost effectiveness what it costs in terms of people who are becoming ill, suffering from diseases and cancers and all the rest of it, because this is a cost. It's a cost to those individuals, and it's a cost to society in terms of their healthcare and other things. So I think it's very important that when we talk about cost effectiveness, we also need to bring that part of it into the equation. And then, I mean, I had actually lots and lots of things, but not to monopolize and to go on too long. Maybe one other issue that I don't think came up so much, but in the discussion about obviously agriculture and working conditions and the environment, fair food prices, because this is a thing as well. I mean, in terms of ensuring that we can actually have sustainable food supplies and food systems and food production, we need to have fair food prices. This is something that the farmers need. This is something that workers need. There's an increasing recognition, I think, by the public that this is one of the key things. A lot of people are looking towards locally produced products. People are looking towards organically produced products. And sadly, if you can afford to buy organic, then you do. But obviously, a lot of people can't do that. And so then they're pushed into buying cheaper, less quality foods. So I think this is also one aspect, of the sort of situation and the discussion that we should also look into. I said a lot more. It was a fascinating, really, really interesting panel, but I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Victor Kempa from ETUI, colleague of Tony and Aude, but we didn't speak about this issue. So I have very practical questions. So there is a big contradiction between opinion. Is there alternative or not? Is a substitution or not? Is there scientific evidence or not? So my question is, what was found, which miracle in countries like nano country Luxembourg and macro country Germany, when they already introduced a ban? So what are the measures on which basis this ban was introduced in these countries?
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions, or I will give the floor again to our speakers? No. Great. So I will leave you reflect on the two questions. Maybe started by Isaline, and then we are going to come back here.
Thank you for the question. Very interesting remark and pertinent remark indeed. As I mentioned, there needs to be this impetus as well, of course, into research, into finding this viable alternative. And with regards to what industry is doing, they're looking into it. Again, it ties into what you just said with your remark on what is a viable alternative and what is cost beneficial. So to be the most cost beneficial alternative as compared to glyphosates, for example, we're not there yet. Now, we have the industry part, we have the research part, we have the development part of things. I also, in this regard, really want to highlight that if there are new viable alternatives that have been found, then it is a large and quite complex procedure to then have them assessed and approved afterwards, which is also something that we need to look into, because this is not only costly, but this is also it takes a long period of time to approve these alternatives. So when we're looking at what is available, oftentimes the burden comes on industry and it's targeting them to see, have you done enough so far? And I think we also need to look, of course, at the procedure that comes afterwards to see if there is already something that's available, make sure that the procedure then afterwards to approve it and to implement it afterwards can become more simplified, it can become also more transparent, as was mentioned, to make sure that it is implementable sooner in the actual workplace.
Thank you very much for this remark. Enrico, do you want to comment on the cost effectiveness, the bigger picture, and also the practice?
Yeah, so as I said before, the alternatives in reality are already there, already exist. It's just a matter of promoting them. And I think that in this situation, we cannot leave to the market just the transition to be guided. I mean, it has to be politics, politicians that guide the transition, because we talk about public interest, we talk about health and safety, we talk about the environment. So are the public authorities, the European institutions, national governments that have to guide this transition towards less pesticides, towards a ban to glyphosate. We cannot expect that is the industry that is going to drive this kind of transition. And when it comes to cost effectiveness, this will be there if we are able to promote the alternatives that already exist. And as I said, we need a series of measures. We need a governance, we need resources, we need training, we need upskilling, reskilling. We need a clear trade policies that ensure that the agricultural sector doesn't lose in Europe its competitiveness. So we need a series of measures. It doesn't happen from one day to another. But yes, we can say that a ban to glyphosate would certainly accelerate this process, because at the end, it would trigger a much more fast investment in research and development of alternatives that are already there, but can be even better implemented, and the new alternatives can be found. On the question concerning food prices from Sarah, she's totally right, and I can tell you that as EFAT, we always say that behind low food prices, most of the time we have also deplorable working conditions. We saw it in the meat sector in particular, but also in general in the agricultural sector. I think it's true that when it comes to food prices, a lot of food stuff has a very low cost, but at the same time, I think the best strategy to improve working conditions and also to ensure that farmers can really have sustainable practices is not just to increase the cost to consumers. At the end, consumers are workers as well. So there, it would be much more complicated. It's a discussion about raising purchasing power. And particularly in this moment, it would be complicated and also politically difficult to increase food prices, that nevertheless are already increasing because of what is happening now in Ukraine, geopolitical tension, and many other reasons. But what we should look at is the distribution of income across the food chain. So there are actors in the food chains that are making huge profits. Major food transnational companies are making huge profits. Retailers are making huge profits. The chemical, agrofertilizer and agrochemical industry is making huge profits. And what we saw across the food chain is a process of concentration that happens at each and every stage of the food chain, where the big ones hit the small ones and the small ones die. And those that are paying the highest price are the small farmers in this game, and in particular also agricultural workers, which are really at the end of the chain, and they pay really the highest price, even more than farmers. So by ensuring that the markets deliver also for farmers, for those that are at the bottom of the chain, is the way forward. But to do that, we need to redistribute wealth and the income across the food chain. And also in that respect, we have a lot of initiatives and proposals, but we will need another webinar to do.
Yes, thank you very much, Enrico, for these comments. And I hate to do that, but for the two last speakers, can you contain your comments to 1 to 2 minutes? Because I would like to finish sort of on time, so we have 10 minutes break before the next session. Sarah, please.
I will do my best, and I mean, a lot of what I wanted to say, Enrico has already said, so that's really good. When it comes to fair food prices, indeed, you need to look at where the money is going. And I mean, I think it's clear if you, for instance, buy directly from the farmer, of course, it's a very different story. So we need to think about that system. And well, one of the things that we could also do is, for instance, lower the VAT for organic foods. I mean, that's one of the things that we could also do to make sure that, for instance, it's not only those with bigger wallets that are able to afford organic food. I think that's one of the things that we could do. And then maybe also importantly, when it comes to the alternatives, I think we need to be very careful not to switch one chemical to another chemical. I mean, we might end up with something that's even worse in the end. I mean, and it's often something that we've seen with chemical regulation. Think about PFAS, PFOS, etc., the forever chemicals. You know, you just replace one with another, and then in the long run, it seems, oh, but this was even worse. So, you know, that is not going to cut it. We really need a new model. For me, that's the organic model. And I mean, what's the difference? It's often indeed the support of the authorities. If you look, for instance, at Austria, you have a lot more organic farming there than, for instance, here in Belgium. And it's a question of support to farmers, and it's a question of a different model. So, I mean, there, let's really be careful and not switch one chemical with another one.
Thank you very much. And Tony, for the last words.
Yes, thank you, Oda. Of course, I wanted to react on many things, but maybe I will just mention the study that we did a few years ago on the costs of occupational cancers. So we did a study to try to estimate those costs, and those costs are huge. So they are around 2 to 4% of the EU GDP each year. So that's billions of euros. And the problem that we have is that we have a lag time between exposure and, of course, the outset of the disease. And so it means that at the end, the costs are on workers and their families. Of course, we have costs for employers. We have huge costs for social security, but most of the costs, unfortunately, are on workers. And this is a big problem. But indeed, that's extremely important to look at the whole picture and to take into also account these costs that are huge for society as a whole. Last thing that I wanted to really say is that so we have good workers' protection legislation in the EU, and we have the carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotox directive. But unfortunately, for that piece of legislation to apply, the substance need to be recognized as a carcinogen. And this is not the case for glyphosate. So glyphosate is out of that legislation because it's not recognized as a carcinogen. And of course, just to conclude, the best way to avoid all those cancers is to phase out from the market these very hazardous substances. So I think that glyphosate must be banned as soon as possible to avoid all those cancers. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Big round of applause for all of our panelists and for all of you to staying with us. And now you have, and I'm sorry for that, 8 minutes break before the next panel. Thank you again.